Next, from the state capitol, negotiations recently produced agreement over what regulations would apply if Illinois approved fracking. That's a method of using hydraulic pressure to squeeze natural gas and oil from shale rock deep in the earth. We first hear from Mark Denzler of the Illinois Manufacturers Association about the advantages of fracking for the economy. We'll then talk with an environmental attorney who was part of the negotiations about how environmental concerns were overcome. This runs about 10 minutes.
Can you just kind of start from the top, and what's the agreement?
Sure. There's an historic agreement that's been reached between the governor's office, the attorney general, members of industry, and the environmental community on high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Illinois is home to the New Albany Shale in southeast Illinois. It's bits and parts of about 19 counties that start in Effingham or Coles County and move south all the way to the bottom of the state and along the Indiana border. And we have the ability to unlock these energy reserves through high-volume hydraulic fracturing, which means that we can do a couple of things. Number one, we can create tens of thousands of new jobs and additional revenue for the state. Number two, we can decrease our reliance on foreign oil and make sure that it's domestic oil. And the third thing that we can do is we can protect the environment at the same time and ensure low-cost sources of energy for decades to come. So it's kind of a win-win proposition for the state of Illinois.
Do we know, first of all, I think $100 million in leases have already been lent out.
Correct.
When, presuming this bill now goes through, which would be anticipated, I think everyone wanted to come to an agreement before they crafted the legislation. Is there a timeline for when drilling would start, when people would start getting hired and the state would start reaching some revenue?
Sure. Well, once the bill becomes law, which we hope it does, companies have already begin signing leases. There's been over $100 million in leases. But industry is not going to move forward until there's a regulatory framework in place. Each well costs $5 to $25 million, so they're not going to make that type of investment unless they know the structure they're operating under. Once the bill is signed, no, it could be potentially just a matter of months before we see high-volume hydraulic fracturing occur. Keep in mind, Terry, that we have been fracking in Illinois for 50 to 60 years, which is straight down fracking. High-volume hydraulic fracturing, you go down and then you go out. So there's actually less surface disruption than there is in normal fracturing.
And do we know what kind of a revenue stream on a percentage basis would be going to the state? Obviously, the state needs revenue.
Sure. Those negotiations are still ongoing in terms of what revenue may be generated. However, we know that there'll be increased property taxes, there'll be increased sales taxes. The New Albany Shale in Illinois closely resembles the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas. That's what geologists say. And so it potentially could be very lucrative for the state, but we're still working on that final piece of the puzzle about the revenue. There will be fees in here for companies that want to drill or want to frack, and those will go to the Department of Natural Resources to make sure that we have the adequate personnel that can process applications, make sure that companies are registered and they're operating correctly in the state.
If there is some environmental damage, and as I understand it, the primary concern would be, let's say, maybe there's a split in the casing as it goes down, or you're bringing the liquid up, especially because of that fluid that's being used in the fracking process. What agency has regulatory responsibility for that? First of all, let's just say that.
Sure. And the Department of Natural Resources will have oversight of the program. Certainly the EPA will be involved as well. And so fracturing already has to meet a number of state, federal, and local regulations, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. So this regulatory framework will go on top of those other regulations. And so there'll be a number of different entities that have some oversight. But in the state of Illinois, in terms of licensing and approving, and the oversight will be the Department of Natural Resources.
And in the negotiations, was there a wide disagreement, or because it's already been done in other states, could you not look to see what were the best practices and then utilize them here?
Sure. There was a very wide disagreement when we started. Industry had worked with the environmental community and gotten agreement on a bill a year ago that dealt with three issues: water management, chemical disclosure, and wellhead protection. It came to the House. Some House members of the attorney thought it'd go far enough. So we've been working for about 7 months on this new framework that's in addition to what we'd passed in the Senate previously. And so there will be, on the environmental side, and again, we're going to make sure that if there is a spill, it's cleaned up by the operator, that everything runs correctly, that, there is hopefully no damage to the environment whatsoever.
has there been?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me finish. So, getting to your question, you asked about other states. We certainly look. There are a number of other states. This is not new technology, Terry. High volume hydraulic fracturing has been occurring in the U.S. for about 12 to 15 years.
Well, I was going to say we have Western Pennsylvania,
Correct.
North Dakota.
Absolutely. The Dakotas, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Texas, California. There's high volume fracturing occurring under the city of Hollywood today.
And I was going to say,
example.
is there any example where there's been any kind of a massive environmental problem?
No, and that's one of the things that we had to work through, the anecdotal scare stories of my water catching on fire or a well being contaminated. There's about 1,200 high volume hydraulic fracturing wells. There's been no proven cases of water contamination, for example. There's been anecdotal scores, and we've had to address those, and it's kind of a facts versus myth. So every time there's a myth, we had to actually show the scientific proof. But the important thing about Illinois is you had to create something unique, because Illinois is different than Texas, it's different than California, different than the Dakotas, and so we could look at other states and what they were doing. In some cases, we expanded them. In other cases, maybe we had to moderate them a little bit, but we had to create a bill that fits for Illinois. Illinois' model may not fit any other state. It may not fit California, Texas, Oklahoma, but it fits here.
Jennifer Castle, attorney with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. What is your view of the agreement that was reached today to allow fracking to proceed forward in Illinois?
We're really encouraged by this new bill. As I think has been explained in several other contexts, the environmental coalition, the environmental groups that are working on this bill are certainly not here because we're excited that fracking is imminent in the state, but we believe that it is, and we know that we have now an absolutely inadequate and insufficient regulatory framework to make sure that fracking is done in a safe and protected way.
So this bill will incorporate different regulations or new regulations that have been negotiated, is that right? And then
That's right.
If that's the case, then run us through what were you arguing for before you signed off on an agreement on this?
Absolutely. Well, some of the lessons that we have been able to learn from other states is that fracking can pose and has posed threats to water, both groundwater and surface water. It creates a lot of air pollution through the flaring and the venting of gases that come up through flares, depending on the type of material that's sought in the well, that's gotten through the well. So air and water protections were crucial. Disclosure of what chemicals are being used and being injected deep underground into our water tables and below them was another crucial component of what we were concerned about. And finally, of course, public participation. As environmental watchdog groups, we're always concerned in making sure that we have a voice at the table, that we are able to review applications, we're able to review permits, and that we're able to enforce the provisions of environmental statutes that are put on the books. And all three of those have now been put into this current bill.
And who IDNR, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, will be the enforcement agency?
They will be the agency charged with administering and implementing the bill. There are certainly roles for both the AG, state's attorneys, the Illinois EPA, and several other agencies to work in conjunction with DNR in making sure this bill is correctly enforced.
You mentioned that there were the concerns on the air and water. What regulations will address those concerns?
We've got a number of regulations that we think are at least fundamental protections that will begin to address our concerns about both air and water pollution. Water pollution, we have one of our greatest achievements, we think, is that wastewater that comes back up the well that is laced with these chemicals and other materials will be stored in closed tanks. Now, this is a great achievement for several reasons. In a lot of other states, those waters are stored in open pits. When there's a storm, that water can overflow, it can contaminate surface water, it can leach through and get into groundwater. With closed tanks that are in fact buffered by other pools or buffers to ensure that nothing leaks out of them, we're minimizing the risk of water contamination.
For how long will that be in a closed tank?
Well, the closed tank is what the water is required to be in there for, I believe it can be in closed tanks for, I think it may be up to 2 months, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's only there temporarily before it's put into injected into deep injection wells for disposal underground.
Okay, and as far as the concerns on air pollution, how is it, I didn't understand the air pollution aspect of it, since we're drilling thousands of feet underground. How does the air get polluted?
Sure. Well, what happens when you're drilling for oil or gas is that when you're fracking, a huge rush of oil and gas comes up the well, and oftentimes you won't be able to control that entire rush, and so you may be able to channel some of that material, certainly the oil if you're an oiler, but the gas and other chemicals coming up through the well may be harder to control, harder to limit, and pose a lot of risks to people's health because of the carcinogenic nature of some of those pollutants. So what we're seeking to do and what has been drafted in this bill is the requirement that companies capture those gases, essentially that they channel those gases into productive uses, that they use them in on-site generators, that they connect them to a pipeline, that they do something with them that doesn't involve just releasing them up into the air or burning them off into the air, which still releases a good number of pollutants. If they're not able to do that, if it's technically infeasible or economically unreasonable for them to do so, then they'll need to flare those gases. Again, flaring, combusting those gases destroys a very large percent, if done properly, of the dangerous gases and the dangerous pollutants that come up through that gas.
From your standpoint, last question, what was the most contentious issue that had to be worked out?
Setbacks, exactly how far a well needs to be from in location, residences, houses, rivers and streams, hospitals. That was one of the biggest issues of contention. Obviously, industry doesn't want to limit the land area in which they're able to frack, but we also are obviously adamant that there need to be protections in place to make sure that these wells are not right in front of someone's house, right next to a crucial water supply, right in front of a children's school.
How much of a setback did you want, and what will the legislation say?
You know, there have been lots of numbers back and forth. The legislation will provide for a number that is equal to a lot of the other states in the country in terms of distances from residences and
Will that be in the thousands of feet or hundreds?
it will be in the hundreds of feet for both residences and hospitals and some water sources. One intake that we're particularly happy, I mean, again, not 100%, but happy with the setback for is from public water supply intakes. We will have the greatest setback in the country from those crucial water supply sources.
Okay, and then likely, as far as you know, how long would it be before the drilling can go forward, or is that not a question maybe that you could answer?
You know, it will very much depend on how contentious this bill process is. Obviously, we're hoping that in light of the broad coalition that came into these negotiations, that we'll be able to get this bill moving forward with, you know, little modification, minimal modification. And then certainly the permitting process will have to start. The applications are comprehensive applications that need to provide a lot of information. So certainly not before, you know, it'll take a number of months before both the bill is passed and before any fracking can begin to take place.
Let me ask, was there any negotiation where once revenues are being gained from the drilling, are any monies going to any environmental groups or any monies going to IDNR to provide for the regulatory personnel that would be involved?
The regulatory fees and costs are still being discussed. Obviously, there is the plan is that a number of fees and fines and other enforcement costs will go back to DNR or IEPA or the agency that is engaged in that enforcement to make sure that that is in place. Obviously, for us, a crucial aspect of enforcement was making sure that we do have citizen suits, the availability for citizens to come in and bring to court any violators of the law so that if DNR or IEPA don't have the resources to do so, we can stand in for them and act as private attorneys general in ensuring this law is.
If you did that, is that on your own dollar, or are you getting any income stream from the drilling?
We're not getting any income stream from the drilling at all. There's a provision that we could potentially get costs of the litigation depending on the outcome of the litigation. But that would be very much on Citizens Group's own initiative.
All right, Jennifer Cassell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.